I never thought I'd go to war in my own neighborhood, but after 42 years of military service, I found myself battling the most formidable opponent of my career, Karen Wesley, the president of the Cherry Blossom Estates Homeowners Association. The flag had been flying for exactly 16 days when the first letter arrived. Not that I was counting, but precision becomes second nature after 4 decades in uniform. I'd only been retired for 3 months, still adjusting to civilian life in this quiet Virginia suburb. My wife Grace had picked the neighborhood while I was overseeing operations in the Middle East, drawn to its well-maintained lawns and peaceful cul-de-sacs. "A perfect place to finally settle down, Nathan," she told me over a scratchy video call. The flagpole installation had been my first major home project. 25 feet of gleaming aluminum anchored in concrete, professionally installed and illuminated at night according to proper flag etiquette. The stars and stripes that had followed me across 6 continents now flew proudly over my own piece of the country I'd devoted my life to protecting. I was trimming the hedges when I noticed the woman standing at my mailbox, her posture rigid as she slipped an envelope inside. She wore a crisp white blouse tucked into beige slacks, her blonde bob cut with geometric precision. When she spotted me watching, her smile appeared as rehearsed as a military parade. "Good morning," I called out, setting down my clippers. She approached with quick, determined steps. "Mr. Nelson, I presume? I'm Karen Wesley, president of the Cherry Blossom HOA. General Nelson, actually. Retired." I extended my hand. "But Nathan is fine." Her handshake was brief, her eyes already drifting toward my flagpole. "I've left some important information in your mailbox. There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding external installations." "The flagpole?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We have very specific guidelines about displays and structures. I'm sure you'll find everything explained in the notice." Her smile tightened. "Welcome to Cherry Blossom Estates. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards." After she left, I retrieved the envelope. Inside was a form letter citing Section 8.3 of the HOA Covenant. "No permanent structures shall be erected on any lot without prior written approval of the Architectural Review Committee." The letter demanded removal of the unauthorized installation within 7 days, or I would face daily fines of $100. Grace found me still standing in the driveway, letter in hand. "Problem?" she asked, grocery bags balanced in her arms. "Apparently, we've committed a flagpole violation." I folded the notice carefully. "Nothing to worry about. I'll sort it out tomorrow." But as I helped Grace with the groceries, something bothered me about Karen's demeanor. After years reading the body language of foreign diplomats and adversaries across negotiating tables, I recognized the look of someone who expected immediate compliance. This wasn't merely about a flagpole, it was about establishing authority. The following morning, I drove to the address listed on the HOA letterhead, a small office above the community center. The door was open, revealing Karen at a desk covered with neatly arranged folders, a nameplate proudly displaying "President" beneath her name. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to recognition. "Mr. Nelson, I wasn't expecting you. I thought we should discuss the flagpole situation in person." I remained standing, hands clasped behind my back from decades of habit. "I've reviewed the covenants thoroughly and found Section 14.2, which specifically exempts American flags and flagpoles from the approval process, provided they meet certain size requirements. Mine does." Karen's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "That exemption only applies to temporary flag displays, like those small flags people put in their garden beds for Independence Day. Your installation is clearly permanent. The Federal Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 prohibits HOAs from restricting homeowners from displaying the U.S. flag, regardless of the method," I replied calmly. Karen's fingers tapped against her desk. "I'm well aware of federal law, Mr. Nelson, but our covenants were established before that act and have grandfather provisions. Besides, the issue isn't the flag itself, but the structure. The pole is simply too tall and visually disruptive." "I see." I nodded, though I didn't agree. I'd like to request a formal hearing with the board then. Something flickered in her expression, annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. Of course. The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. I'll add you to the agenda. She made a note in her planner. Until then, I'm afraid the removal notice stands. I won't be removing the flagpole, Ms. Wesley. She looked up sharply. Then you'll accrue daily fines until this is resolved. So be it. As I turned to leave, Karen added, You know, Mr. Nelson, most new residents try to integrate into our community before causing disruptions. We value harmony here. I paused at the doorway. In my experience, Ms. Wesley, true harmony isn't about blind compliance but mutual respect. Walking back to my car, I spotted an older gentleman watching me from a bench outside the community center. As I approached, he stood and extended his hand. Norman Parker, he introduced himself. Couldn't help but notice you coming from the Dragon's Lair. I shook his hand. Nathan Nelson. Just moved in last month. Let me guess, flagpole? Garden gnome? Wrong shade of beige on your mailbox? His eyes twinkled with humor, but there was something knowing in his expression. Flagpole, I confirmed. Norman nodded. Karen's on a crusade lately. Ever since Grayson Development started eyeing the empty lot behind Cherry Blossom for that new shopping center. Suddenly every bylaw is being enforced to the letter. What's the connection? Norman glanced around before lowering his voice. Her husband's the commercial real estate broker handling the deal. Word is they stand to make a pretty commission if the development goes through. But they need to show the neighborhood is strictly regulated to maintain property values. The information settled in my mind like reconnaissance data, interesting, potentially useful, but requiring verification. Thanks for the insight, Norman. I should get going. Good luck with your battle, son. Don't let her bulldoze you like she did the Rodriguez family. I stopped. The Rodriguez family? Nice couple, 2 kids. Had a ramp installed for Mrs. Rodriguez's mother who uses a wheelchair. Karen claimed it violated architectural guidelines and fined them until they couldn't afford to stay. House sold at a discount, to Karen's sister-in-law, as it happens. That night, I told Grace about my confrontation with Karen and what Norman had shared. So this isn't really about our flagpole, Grace concluded, her brow furrowed. It rarely is, I replied. In military conflicts or neighborhood disputes, the stated reason is seldom the real one. Grace squeezed my hand. Well, General, looks like you've found your post-retirement mission. Seems that way. I smiled. Think I'll do some reconnaissance tomorrow. Over the next week, I conducted what my staff would have called human intelligence gathering. I introduced myself to neighbors, joined the community center for morning coffee, and volunteered at the local Veterans Outreach program. Everywhere I went, Karen Wesley's name emerged as a common thread of anxiety and resentment. Gabriela Ortiz, who owned the local bakery, told me about the $500 fine she received for displaying a small Best of Arlington award sign in her front yard. It wasn't even commercial advertising, she explained as she handed me a coffee. It was a Community Achievement Award. Tim Johnson, 3 doors down from me, had been battling over his son's basketball hoop for months. They claim it decreases property values, but my real estate agent sister says that's nonsense. Family-friendly amenities actually increase appeal to buyers. Each story reinforced what Norman had suggested. Karen wasn't merely enforcing rules, she was creating an atmosphere of rigid compliance that would appeal to commercial developers looking for stable, predictable neighborhoods for adjacent properties. Meanwhile, the fines from my flagpole continued to accumulate. Each day, a new notice appeared in my mailbox, the total growing like a military budget during wartime. I filed them systematically in a folder labeled Operation Old Glory. 13 days after my visit to Karen's office, a black SUV parked across from my house. A man in a business suit emerged, taking photographs of my property and several others on the street. When he reached my driveway, I stepped outside. "Can I help you?" I asked pleasantly. He lowered his camera. Just documenting the neighborhood for a client. Real estate developer? His hesitation told me everything. I'm not at liberty to discuss my client's interests. I nodded. Of course. Though as a homeowner, I'm naturally curious about activities that might affect my property. Nothing to worry about, he assured me smoothly. If anything moves forward, there will be proper community notifications. After he left, I called Norman. Any chance you could connect me with the Rodriguez family? 2 days later, I sat in Maria Rodriguez's modest apartment, listening as she detailed their experience with Karen Wesley. We begged for a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act, Maria explained, her voice tight with remembered frustration. My mother's disability should have protected us, but Karen claimed that since my mother wasn't on the deed, the accommodation wasn't legally required. Did you consider fighting it? I asked. We consulted a lawyer, but we couldn't afford the ongoing legal fees while paying the daily fines. Eventually, we had to sell. She paused, wiping away a tear. We lost nearly $40,000 selling in a rush, not to mention the cost of moving and the stress it put on my mother. Would you be willing to share your documentation with me? The notices, the correspondence with the HOA? Maria studied me for a moment. What exactly are you planning, General Nelson? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. But I believe in reconnaissance before engagement. 3 weeks after my initial confrontation with Karen, I attended the HOA board meeting, my Operation Old Glory folder tucked under my arm. The community center meeting room was half filled with residents, many of whom I had met during my reconnaissance. Karen sat at the center of a long table, flanked by 4 other board members. My case was listed last on the agenda. For over an hour, I watched as Karen systematically denied reasonable requests from homeowners: a variance for a slightly taller fence for a family with an escape artist dog, permission to plant a vegetable garden in a backyard, approval for solar panels despite their compliance with state renewable energy laws. When my name was finally called, I approached the table with the calm I'd cultivated during countless high-stakes military briefings. Mr. Nelson, you're here to appeal the violation notice regarding your unauthorized flagpole installation, Karen began, her tone suggesting the outcome was predetermined. The board has reviewed your situation and, actually, I interrupted politely. It's General Nelson. 4-star, retired. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members, an older gentleman, sat up straighter. Karen's smile never faltered. Your military service, while appreciated, doesn't exempt you from community guidelines, General. I'm well aware, I replied. But before we address my specific case, I'd like to present some information relevant to all Cherry Blossom residents. Before she could object, I distributed packets to each board member and several audience members. These documents detail a pattern of selective enforcement and potentially discriminatory practices within our HOA. Karen's face flushed. This is completely inappropriate. We're here to discuss your flagpole, nothing else. My flagpole is merely a symptom of a larger issue, I continued calmly. I've compiled evidence suggesting that recent aggressive enforcement of HOA regulations coincides with commercial development interests in adjacent properties, specifically, the proposed Grayson Development Shopping Center. The room went silent. Karen's knuckles whitened around her pen. Furthermore, I've documented multiple instances where regulations were applied inconsistently, including the case of the Rodriguez family, whose accessibility accommodation for a disabled family member was denied on questionable grounds. That case was resolved years ago, Karen snapped. Yes, with the property being purchased by your sister-in-law at below market value, I noted. Which brings me to my main concern. I turned to address the room directly. For the past month, I've been investigating possible conflicts of interest within our HOA leadership. Public records show that Karen's husband, Robert Wesley, is the commercial broker for Grayson Development. Their commission on the proposed shopping center is contingent on maintaining certain property values and aesthetic standards in adjacent neighborhoods, namely ours. The board member to Karen's left, a woman I'd learned was the treasurer, gasped audibly. Karen, you never disclosed this to the board. Karen stood abruptly. This is slander. I'm calling an end to this meeting. Before you do, I continued, you should know that I've already filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Authority regarding potential Fair Housing Act violations. I've also submitted these documents to the State Real Estate Commission regarding the undisclosed conflict of interest. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Karen attempted to adjourn, but the other board members refused to second her motion. Instead, they voted to suspend her pending an investigation and to rescind all outstanding violation notices until policies could be reviewed. As the crowd dispersed, many neighbors stopped to thank me or share their own stories of battles with Karen. Norman clapped me on the shoulder. That was some tactical maneuver, General. Just the opening salvo, I replied. The following weeks brought significant changes to Cherry Blossom Estates. The county investigation uncovered financial irregularities in the HOA accounts, specifically, selective waiving of fines for properties owned by Karen's friends and family while aggressively collecting from others. The State Real Estate Commission launched their own inquiry into Robert Wesley's failure to disclose conflicts of interest. 2 months after the confrontation, Karen and Robert Wesley were charged with multiple counts of fraud and housing discrimination. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page, complete with a photo of Karen being escorted from the HOA office, boxes of documents being carried out by investigators. The interim HOA board, led by the former treasurer Gloria Owens, invited me to join as a special advisor on bylaw revision. We need someone with your strategic thinking, Gloria explained over coffee, and your commitment to fairness. I accepted the role, with one condition. My flagpole stays. Gloria laughed. Nathan, after what you did, you could paint your entire house red, white, and blue, and no one would dare say a word. Today marks 6 months since my retirement from military service. My flagpole stands tall, now joined by several others throughout the neighborhood. The Grayson Development Project was scaled back and redesigned with community input. The Rodriguez family is in the process of buying back their old home, at a fair price, with proper accommodations for Maria's mother. This morning, I raised the flag as I do every day at dawn. Grace joined me on the lawn, handing me a cup of coffee as we watched the stars and stripes catch the breeze. Happy? She asked, leaning against my shoulder. I considered the question. After decades commanding thousands of troops and navigating international conflicts, I had wondered if civilian life would feel insignificant. Instead, I found purpose in a battle fought not with weapons, but with documents and determination, protecting the values I'd spent my life defending, just on a smaller scale. Very, I replied, watching our flag wave proudly above a neighborhood where people could now live without fear of arbitrary rules and hidden agendas. Grace smiled. So what's next, General? Planning to run for mayor? I laughed. One campaign at a time, dear. One campaign at a time. As we walked back to the house, I noticed Norman approaching with a new neighbor in tow. The young woman was pushing a stroller and looking nervously at Norman's elaborate garden gnome display, something that would have earned crushing fines under the old regime. General, Norman called out, I'd like you to meet our newest resident. She's worried about the swing set she wants to install for her kids. I smiled, setting my coffee down on the porch rail. Tell her not to worry. Those days are over. The young mother looked relieved, and in that moment, I felt the same satisfaction I'd experienced after successful military operations, the knowledge that people could live their lives in peace because someone had stood up when it mattered. My flag continued to wave overhead, no longer a symbol of defiance but of victory, not just mine, but everyone's in Cherry Blossom Estates who had regained the freedom to make their homes truly their own.